Hello, welcome to episode 6 of ranking every Doctor Who story ever. As usual, this list is just my opinion, and it's totally fine if you like different stories. This is especially relevant for this episode, because, just by chance, a bunch of really popular stories that I happen to feel tepid about ended up in this episode. I can almost guarantee that if you're a fan of Doctor Who, at least one of my selections in this episode will piss you off. Be prepared. I'm going to start off with a story that most people probably wanted to see a lot lower on the list. In 225th place, it's Hell Bent, one of the most polarizing stories in the show's history. Some people love it, some people absolutely despise it. I just think it's meh. The lengths that the Doctor goes to with the goal of saving Clara are way over the line, but I think there's room in the show for the Doctor to be in the wrong once in a while. However, the episode as a whole is a bit overindulgent, and it deifies Clara to a ridiculous degree, but that's basically a given in Series 8 and 9. Unfortunately, the story contains one of my least favorite scenes in the history of the show, the Doctor shooting the General. The Doctor doesn't even like to shoot in self-defense, so him shooting an unarmed person who posed no immediate threat to anyone couldn't be more out of character. His comment that regeneration is like the man flu does not even sort of justify his actions. If regeneration is really just the man flu, that takes away pretty much all of the heroism in Planet of the Spiders, and the Caves of Androzani, and the Parting of the Ways, and the End of Time, etc. Another problem I had with this story was the brief, unnecessary, and underwhelming inclusion of Rassilon. I'm also not a huge fan of Clara ultimately becoming functionally immortal. I think the story would have worked better if the Doctor did have to return Clara to the moment of her death. It would have perhaps taught the Doctor a lesson, and it would have been interesting and heartbreaking to see him have to make that fateful decision. On the other hand, the fact that the story didn't give a definitive conclusion to the hybrid arc was actually a good thing in my eyes. I really didn't like where it was heading, so I was glad that it was left ambiguous. Likewise, I was glad that the story didn't spend much time on Gallifrey. Outside of the War Games and maybe the Five Doctors, I don't think the show has ever done Gallifrey well, so I was A-okay with the story leaving it as soon as possible. While I've spent most of this review explaining why I hate the story less than other people, there is one thing I genuinely love about the story. It is visually stunning. All in all, I feel like the only Doctor Who fan who doesn't have a strong opinion of this story one way or the other. Moving up to 224th, I'm going with The Snowmen. From the Doctor's depression to Clara's death, this is a lot darker than most Christmas specials. In the positive column, the return of the Great Intelligence is fun for classic fans, Strax provides some nice comic relief, Richard E. Grant is fantastic, Matt Smith and Jenna Coleman are both quite charming, and the whole story has a nice Victorian atmosphere. However, I felt that the story didn't have nearly enough exploration of the Great Intelligence character and its plan. Although by far the worst part of this story was its resolution. A few people crying, somehow saving the day, was just ridiculous. And the fact that we missed out on the chance to have a companion from a time other than modern day was a major disappointment. Moving into 223rd, what I consider to be one of the most overrated stories in the history of the show, Terror of the Zygons. This story came in 14th place in the 2014 Doctor Who magazine poll. 14th! Here's a list of some of the stories that it finished higher than in the poll. Dalek, The 11th Hour, Inferno, The Power of the Daleks, The Ark in Space, The Tomb of the Cybermen, Earthshock, Vincent and the Doctor, Silence in the Library, The Invasion, Midnight, The Time Warrior, The Aztecs. I could go on. I really don't understand how any of those stories are ranked lower than what I see as a completely unoriginal and forgettable story. We'd seen the body-snatching thing before, we'd see it again, and I think it was done much better in several other stories. The Zygons' motivation of wanting to take over Earth was about as original as that person on Tinder who says they like hiking, dogs, and The Office. Meanwhile, the attempt at incorporating the Loch Ness Monster into the story was weak, and the creature had an embarrassingly awful design. You might be wondering why I even put the story as high as I did if I'm complaining about it so much. But don't get me wrong, it's not awful. The incidental music was quite effective in establishing a creepy atmosphere in this story, and all of the main actors were at the top of their game. But I'll take an interesting original story with production issues over a well-made yet unoriginal story any day. In 222nd, another story a lot of people really like, A Good Man Goes to War. This story is completely different from anything the show had done before, but I'm not sure if it's the kind of different that I like. Everything happens so quickly that pivotal moments don't have as much impact as they could have if there was more build-up. I'm primarily referring to River's speech about what the Doctor has become. In a longer story, I think that could have been an all-time great moment, but in this, at least for me, it kind of falls flat. The twist about River's identity is certainly shocking, but it borders on gimmicky. Overall, while this is a very well-written and acted story, it's not one I care to revisit often, as it just doesn't really work as a standalone story. Moving into 221st, another story a lot of people love, Kinda. This story is extremely frustrating to watch due to its wasted potential. The Mara is one of the most genuinely creepy and disturbing enemies in all of Classic Who due to its chilling personification in Tegan's dreams. However, the story spends precious little time on the Mara and instead focuses on the people inside the dome, including the main antagonist, Hindle. Hindle is completely over the top and is not a great villain, which is all the more frustrating when there is a fantastic villain in the very same story that could have been the focus instead. Overall, I'd say the story is kinda good and kinda bad. In 220th, you guessed it, another story a lot of people really love, Carnival of Monsters. This is really a tale of two stories. The one that takes place inside the Miniscope, which was extremely interesting and could have made for an all-time great story, and the one that takes place outside the Miniscope, the ineffectual tale about internal political strife between indistinguishable gray-skinned people. I know that those scenes were meant to be commentary on politics or whatever, but they completely ruin the mystery of the story. Had the Miniscope not been revealed by those scenes, the Doctor walking out of it could have been one of the best cliffhangers ever. While the serial is still quite an entertaining watch due to its originality, it could have been so much better had it taken place almost entirely inside the Miniscope. Into 219th, the shortest Doctor Who story ever, Mission to the Unknown. There isn't much to say about this episode really, as it's a little more than a trailer for the Daleks' master plan. It actually does do a pretty good job of setting the stage for the 12-episode epic, but a Doctor Who story without the Doctor can only be so good. If you are a Doctor Who fan, though, you have to check out the brilliant live-action recreation of this story. It's as good as, if not better than, the animations at bringing missing Doctor Who back to life. Into 218th, definitely not one of the fan favorites, The Space Museum. The story's first episode, with its unsettling, mysterious vibe and its unforgettable cliffhanger, is certainly the high point of this story, but the rest is basically a conventional rebels versus oppressors tale. Although the added element of the main characters knowing their possible fate and trying to alter it does add a unique flavor. Also, it is nice to see Vicky, one of my favorite companions, play a major role in thwarting the enemy. Lastly, the Doctor is hilarious in this story, from trolling the Morlock with the mind-reading machine to laughing like a little kid inside the Dalek. Into 217th, we return to the new show with The Witchfinders. This story is not bad, but it's a bit of a snooze fest. It definitely has its merits. King James is quite an entertaining character, it's interesting to see the Doctor have to deal with sexism directed towards her, and the Doctor's speech about pointing fingers at others so nobody points fingers at you is fantastic. But overall, the story is dull compared to most of the other Whittaker-era historicals, which I consider to be the highlight of her era. In 216th, we move from a Chris Chibnall-era story to a story written by Chris Chibnall, Dinosaurs on a Spaceship. Normally, if a story's plot is interesting, I'll like the story overall, even if some other aspects have issues. However, while I do actually like most of this story's plot, other things really bring it down for me. As for why I liked the plot, I loved the idea of a Silurian arc. It presented a golden opportunity to have a completely original style of Silurian story. However, all of the Silurians were gone, which was a major disappointment. One of the really big issues I had with this story were those two robots. I found their dialogue painfully unfunny. To be honest, they actually make it difficult for me to watch this story. And while this is a bit of a nitpick, I disliked the scene where the Doctor rode the Triceratops, as he clearly could have moved a lot faster and more directly on his own feet. The dinosaurs in general, which at least look a lot better than they did in Invasion of the Dinosaurs, unfortunately do not serve much purpose in the story. Ultimately, the episode as a whole is just kind of forgettable despite its title. Into 215th, the second Zygon story I'm going to talk about in this episode, the Zygon Invasion and the Zygon Inversion. This story is of course most famous for the Doctor's anti-war speech. And yes, that is a powerful speech delivered brilliantly by Capaldi. Also, Jenna Coleman is fantastic as the villain in that scene, and in the story as a whole. However, I have some major issues with the rest of the story. In general, I dislike the story's lack of subtlety when dealing with real-world issues. The plot is very clearly trying to be a statement on the war on terror and the refugee crisis, but the situations have a fundamental difference. In the story, Zygons are assuming the appearances and identities of humans, while refugees in the real world are simply trying to find somewhere safe. Zygons have to get disguises from somewhere, so they must take the form of existing humans. This seems like a complete breach of privacy. It also bothers me that Zygons are portrayed as angry brutes in their normal form, and are only portrayed sympathetically when they're in human form. It almost felt like an endorsement of assimilation. Meanwhile, the whole thing with Osgood refusing to reveal whether she's human or Zygon is stupid. The Doctor is completely reasonable in wanting to know if the Osgood he's talking to is the person he has met before and formed memories with, or if she's just a stranger. Trying to say that it doesn't matter which one is which is just silly. They are two different individuals. All of these things wouldn't have bothered me that much if the story hadn't been so overt with its political message. I don't even mind overt political messages, but if you're going to be overt, don't make false equivalencies. And I think that's what this story does. But at the end of the day, that speech. Into 214th, I'm going with The Edge of Destruction. While I think it was a great idea to set an episode entirely inside the TARDIS so early on in the show's history so that viewers could perhaps become more familiar with the ship, unfortunately, the story does not actually explore the ship very much. Sure, it does a decent job of developing the relationships between the characters, but did we really need an entire story for that? Season 1 is filled with 6 and 7 episode stories, so I'm sure the writers could have fit the development into those stories instead. It's worth a watch due to its unique nature, but it's still pretty forgettable. Into 213th, I'm going with Extremis. In and of itself, this is a pretty good episode of Doctor Who, and there's a very specific reason why I put it so low. That reason is that the intriguing plot threads that it sets up are not brought to satisfactory conclusions in the 2 subsequent episodes. An argument could be made that I shouldn't hold the shortcomings of other episodes against this one, but in my opinion, a good build-up isn't worth much if it isn't wrapped up well. I can enjoy a story with a lackluster conclusion if it's more of a lighthearted adventure, like Time Heist, but when it comes to more serious stories, I need a well-executed conclusion to truly appreciate the story. I also had a bit of a philosophical problem with the story. I find it hard to believe that everyone who previously thought they were real would willingly kill themselves when they learned they lived in a simulation. The idea that they were trying to sabotage the monks' plan to invade Earth makes the mass suicide a bit more believable, but there's no way that all of the people would kill themselves. If I found out I lived in a simulation, I'd shrug and move on with my life. Moving up to 212, I'm going with Planet of Evil. Starting off with some positives, the atmosphere of the planet that this story is set on is really spooky, and I loved the idea that it was on the edge of the known universe. Another strong point was the cliffhanger at the end of episode 3, where it looks like the Doctor and Sarah are going to get sucked out into space. However, the overall plot is nothing special, it's more or less just a generic base under siege story. I also don't like how the story takes the real scientific concept of antimatter and uses it in a completely unscientific way. While the Doctor did describe what actually happens when matter and antimatter meet, annihilation, the only thing that the actual antimatter in the story seemed to do was make people hairy or dehydrated. But at the end of the day, this is an early Tom Baker story, and even the weaker ones are still decent. And in 211th, what better way to finish off this episode than with another fan favorite, The Mind Robber. I do give this story massive credit for its originality and surreal atmosphere, but I don't think it handled those aspects particularly well. For starters, much of episodes 2, 3, and 4 feel like a little kid's show. And for such a transcendental story not even set in reality, the way in which the enemy was ultimately defeated, Zoe and Jamie pressing a bunch of buttons, was extremely underwhelming. The story as a whole felt tied too much to reality, particularly when the Master, no, not that Master, threatens the Earth. I think the story would have worked better had it taken place completely outside the context of reality. Alright, that's going to do it for episode 6. Thank you for watching. If you're interested to see the rest of the list, be sure to subscribe for future episodes. Next up will be episode 7, which should be out shortly. See you next time.